Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome to another episode of Islam for Europeans. I'm your host, Robert. Please like and subscribe to the channel. And welcome back, the Islam for Europeans fam. I wanted to talk about the upcoming debate between Keith Woods and Daniel Hakikaju. It's supposed to take place on Monday, September 30th, and it's supposed to be, I think, moderated by Sneeko. Now, I'm going to go on a limb here and say that, this debate slash discussion is basically a train wreck, waiting to happen. I'm going to explain why. Now, a couple of things, just in general, when you have, Twitter or like the online world, you're going to meet people that are just have far more extreme opinions, than the general population, right? So, like your everyday normal people aren't really going to get much out of this. I would never show this, to my non-Muslim friends and family, and, unless they were like, interested on these particular topics. Um, this kind of discussion is not really intended for like, like the general audience. Please keep in mind that, based on, recent polling, most non-Muslims have either like a neutral view of like Islam and Muslims, or even like a slightly positive view. Um, and basically the whole online world has that problem built in, right? So that's definitely one thing. But just in general, the topic is supposed to be on white identity. Now, this is problematic for several reasons. Number one is that by framing it in this particular way, you're basically juxtaposing Muslims on one side and white people on the other side, as if those two groups could never, ever, ever, they're completely diametrically opposed to one another, and they're two completely distinct groups. So that's one problem right off the bat. Even though I mean maybe even Daniel doesn't believe that. And Muslims in general don't believe that. There are like millions of white Muslims, such as myself. But just to frame it in that way, it just really creates this kind of like this kind of Hegelian dialectic where you have basically Muslims are the in group, white people are the out group, or vice versa, right? So that definitely is problematic, I'd say. And this falls in line with kind of like Islamo leftist language, like using terms like coconut for like a non-practicing Muslim, or the overarching term the West as juxtaposed with Islam as an argument. So that's problematic in and of itself. But just to have this topic, because this is such a sore spot, white identity. I mean, it's just there's the vast majority of Muslims and the vast majority of white Europeans, whether they're on the right or not, are not going to come to terms and have an agreement, with this type of debate and discussion. And both sides, let's be honest, the main reason why you create a whole, like social media account and be an online social media presence, it's not to invite people to Islam. Unfortunately, it's not to improve the image of Islam overall in the West. You're doing this for likes and subscribes, and try to increase your image, and your popularity. Um, and to have such a hot button topic like this that these two sides are probably not going to agree on, because a lot of it, I have an idea of where it's going to go. It's very similar to when Daniel debated Mark, and that is that it goes back to the whole idea of colonialism. Basically, on the Muslim side, especially even on the non-Muslim, non-white side, the whole narrative is white people enslaved the entire world. They killed hundreds of millions of people. They brought destruction upon the entire earth. They'll use figures such as Britain owes India $45 trillion. They stole the Koh-i-Noor diamond. They looted and plundered the entire world, and thus that means that mass immigration in every single European country and all the outpost country is not only justified but completely necessary. That it's basically payback, right? Now I'm paraphrasing here. I mean, Daniel uses a lot more nuance, nuance that you can't really catch on Twitter. As an aside, the Daniel and Keith really didn't get off on the right foot. Like he's basically using like those same type of arguments, but but on the white European, especially on the right wing side, their narrative is um, colonialism brought about all these technological advancements, improvements in irrigation methods, medicine, law, um, like ethics. They'll say things like the British Raj, they ended sati, which is like this kind of Hindu practice where the wife, if a husband died, a wife would basically kill herself by throwing herself on a pyre. Um, they'll say things like the Bengal famine. There's like this enormous population increase in the Bengal because they have so many improved irrigation and agricultural methods, which resulted in this population increase. Infant mortality went down dramatically, and this was due to a monsoon basically, and there's not much that Churchill could have done. So you get into all these kind of like arguments that are just going to turn so incendiary that it's just going to be a back and forth and just constant arguing, not just between Daniel and Keith, but also the people in the chat. When there's so many other topics that you could be talking about. I mean, Keith is not an anti-Islam figure. He's far more pro-Islam than many of the other people on the dissident right. Right. So, but the thing is, if you keep talking, if you keep bringing up things that are just you're never going to agree upon, you're going to lose people that potentially would have otherwise had no problem with Islam in and of itself. Right. So, I mean, I can't see it going very well. Right. And I don't even agree that these type of debates are fruitful in general. I think it's much more productive if you talk about things with people who are basically converts to Islam is a perfect example. Why have not white converts to Islam not collectivized in any way, shape, or form? Because when you look at populations in non-Muslim, non-white countries or populations that have converted to Islam as a group, the culture of the people is basically preserved. Like you can take a look at African American Muslims in the United States, the Tzotzil Muslims in Chiapas, Mexico, Latino Muslims in the United States, South African Muslims of African descent. These people all converted to Islam as a group, right? So when one of their people in their tribe converts to Islam, they already have the infrastructure in place. It's not feeling as foreign to them. They keep the cultural aesthetics of the people, right? So Islam is not a demographic threat to them because when someone converts to Islam, it's very likely that their spouse will not divorce them. And they already have a marriage pool of people from a similar ethnic background. And we've already discussed these things in detail at Islam for Europeans. And Daniel would be smart to bring up this paradox in that basically the more a population hates on Islam when there's already an Islamic presence, and people are going to convert to Islam from your group whether you like it or not. But the more you hate on Islam, it's going to be worse for your demographic situation because that convert is going to get kicked out of their family's house or written out of the will, or they'll cut all their tuition. They're going to be disowned by their family, and you're going to basically leave them no choice but to assimilate into an existing Muslim community, right? And if that hatred didn't exist, you would see European Muslim sub communities, basically in every country in Europe, like you do with Bosnia, right? So when a Bosnian Christian converts to Islam, there's several Bosnian Muslims that you can marry. There's already a sub community of Bosnians. They've got, it's already in line with their cultural aesthetic, right? So like and the thing is, I think you have to realize that people who are engaged in Dawa, like Muslim influencers and things like that, they only have two gears. And I'm not saying this to be offensive. I'm just saying that this basically the way it is because of the people they interact with. The two gears they have when giving Dawa is one, someone who's on the precipice of converting to Islam. So the goal is to talk about Islam as much as you can, answer all their misconceptions, convince them that they should take their shahada, basically going from the preparation to the action stage. And the other gear is basically arguing with Islamophobes, the people who really hate Islam. How can I refute this person and intellectually blast them into the next universe? And if they're being insulting, just insult them back. To give the Muslim community this kind of sense of superiority. And I'm saying this because whether it's on the online world or in a Dawa booth, those are basically the only non-Muslims they interact with. Rarely do you find a situation where you have someone who's not interested in converting, but at the same time they don't really harbor any feeling ill will or harsh feelings towards Islam in and of itself. You can A lot of people don't realize this, but Keith was actually on the Dean Show last October, and it was actually a really productive conversation. It never turned into an argument. Eddie was very patient and very wise, and like he talked about like kind of the same the issue at hand, but sprinkled in like some like the old like his own Islamic take on it. So that's a very productive conversation. But I honestly I hope I'm wrong, but I don't. You don't really kind of see the same things with Daniel. Now, Daniel has blocked me on Twitter. If he wants to discuss these things further, I'm more than welcome to. But I don't see that happening anytime soon. I mean, if someone wants to share this video, what I recommend is talk about this: the fact that you know why why have European Muslims not collectivized? And if they did, it would be a positive thing, for any Western country. It would be a bulwark against liberalism. You wouldn't have to put current Muslim populations into pogroms. If the Muslim population advocated that the converts themselves, form their own organizations, their own restaurants, their own fora, their own marriage networks, then it would actually increase the total fertility rate. And that's one great thing to talk about. The other thing is Keith and a lot of people in the distant right, they get their even though Keith, like I said, he's not anti-Islam, but he gets a lot of his opinions about Islam from Edward Dutton's book, Why Islam Makes You Stupid, but also means it'll conquer the world, which was changed to Islam an Evolutionary Perspective. And that video that they made with Richard and Ed Dutton, that was taken down basically. So it's very difficult to find that video. But they were Ed's book, basically the basics of Islam. Ed got right, but like the sensitive topics that require a lot of like Islamic education to fully analyze. Things that are practiced in the Muslim world that are either completely haram or allowed, but basically not encouraged, or a much milder variant of that is allowed, or it's just basically a historical artifact that existed back in the day, but it's not relevant in today's standards. So in Edward Dutton's book, what he got wrong is that those particular topics, like they're, it gives a false impression that Islam advocates for all this stuff. And what I'm talking about is things like female genital mutilation, FGM, slavery. We can go by these topics. FGM, only a very mild variant of that is allowed, not the type 0 to type 4 pharaonic horrible practice that's practiced in many African countries, both Muslims and Christians. And FGM is almost non-existent in many other Muslim countries. So that's one thing. Slavery, it existed in every single country in the world. It was, you couldn't live without slavery back in the day. Like you couldn't move a 30-pound object without an animal or a human being. And Dr. Jonathan Brown's book "Slavery in Islam" goes to that at length. But Islam has a great reward for freeing slaves. And like the scholars at the time, in the 20th century, they basically agreed that slavery is it's an artifact now. It's not necessary. We have technological advancements, so it's not like it's Islam is about enslaving every single non-Muslim. I mean, this is something that the scholars have talked about at length, and especially in the postmodern era, it's just not a conversation worth getting into. But it would merit a discussion as to the nuances involved in slavery. Cousin marriage, cousin marriage is allowed in Islam, but it's not something that's mustahab or or like something that's outright encouraged. Like if a population were to embrace Islam, it's not something that's necessary. like in uh, among African American Muslims, cousin marriage, is almost completely non-existent. Like yeah. So and things like they kind of use some people on the extreme, like on the Muslim side will say it's completely justified to like ogle and grope like European women and like there's no way you can possibly justify things like grooming gangs, from an Islamic perspective. And I hope that, Daniel will be smart enough to kind of like dispel these misconceptions if it goes there. Um, but yeah, like I said, yeah, terrible topic, to make it like, basically the arc of your discussion. I hope Sneak will be good at moderating it, but it's just a bad idea from the get-go. For, the reasons that I explicated previously. And just in general, I mean, Daniel is just not really a likable person. I mean, he has many tendencies of narcissistic personality disorder, lack of empathy, grandiose sense of self, unable to take criticism. He's just not really a person that you want to bring home to your non-Muslim family. He can be very argumentative, haughty, and maybe this is just his online persona. This is how he get likes. This is how he gets likes and everything. But yeah, he's just not a likable guy. And you don't want someone like that, representing, the entire Muslim ummah for this particular debate. Like regardless of where your opinions may lie. Um, and yeah, I just think that it has the potential to be a real train wreck, right? Um, yeah, so I've talked at length about this. I'm trying to think of some other points. Um, yeah, before I, say, before I sign out, I'm just going to put a pause on this, see if I have any additional notes, inshallah. Yeah, so the last point I want to make is that, in general, trying to, interview the dissident right, in hopes that they will convert to Islam after you'd argued with them at length about, like socio-historical arguments like colonialism, constructs such as white identity. That's the other thing that there are several European cultures. My take on white identity is that you know um, there are several other peoples in the world that don't have a state, and they've survived. They've kept their own particular culture, and they've gone through very difficult times, being stateless. Um, but there's still something that wants them to realize that there's like this kind of kinship, with these particular groups that you're in. I mean, like Islam recognizes that we all come from different peoples and different tribes, and Islam never meant to erase that. Like so you have many different Muslim populations that have this same kind of like wolf pack mentality. Like you know, Arabs have this rich history of like a shared language, a shared heritage, a shared culture. Um, like Indonesians have the same thing. Um, so it's compatible with that on a theoretical level. I just think that really did rethink about how that can be in the postmodern era where you have non-Muslim populations where the Muslim population is coming from other countries, Northeast Asia, the West, Latin America. Muslims need to really rethink about how they run their mosques and how they deal with converts in general. And I think that's more productive because you're dealing with people who've actually converted to Islam. So we really need to rethink about that. But just in general, trying to convince people on the who are public figures in the dissident right after you'd argue with them at length about things you're never going to agree upon, and then ask them to convert to Islam. Um, like if these people are too entrenched in their own organizations. What do I mean by that? That converting to Islam for them would be such an enormous leap. They would lose a lot of their followers. They would basically, there's potential that they would be kicked out of their group. There's potential that, they would lose everything. They would have to reformulate this kind of new internet persona. I mean, Sneeko was able to pull that off, but again, Sneeko, he's not white. So, it's easier for him to, have this kind of like take on this kind of, overall Muslim identity. That's much more difficult to do as a white person, especially, a white identitarian. Um, so I think, it's just kind of lack of realization that, just looking at it from how many people can get to convert to Islam, it's just become like this kind of numbers game, as opposed to how do we make this, it easier for people from this certain population to convert to Islam in the first place and be able to survive and thrive, as a Muslim, and in keeping their, their cultural identity. Inshallah, that's a very important topic that we kind of tried to address ourselves, but I don't think that publicly talking to these people is a good idea in the hopes that they're going to convert to Islam en masse. If anything, it's just going to create this greater dichotomy. So the white people who are interested in Islam or believe that it has merit, you're just going to make it even more difficult because you're just placing them on opposite sides of the boxing ring. So that's my time for the day. Let me know what you think in the chat. Like I said, I'm an open book. I'm willing to even debate Daniel on this, even though he's blocked me on Twitter. I don't think that'll happen. But, like I said, if you are a fan of Islam for Europeans, please feel free to pass this video along to Daniel before the debate begins in hopes that he'd at least take some Cole's notes down, so, it can actually be productive as it can be. But, in general, I actually, agree with, many Muslims who think that, it's not a good idea in general, to have like these kinds of discussions, with the dissident right, for the reasons that I just stated. And, you know, um, yeah, I mean, even though they think that, like Daniel's, kowtowing to racists and stuff like that. Um, yeah, as a final note, this whole idea of racism, like just even the terms themselves, like many people in the dissident right say racism is basically I belong to an in group, I care about my in group, and there are differences, but cultural, ethnic differences between peoples, and just basically just an acknowledgement of that. That's what they think racism is. Whereas people on like the left or even mainstream Muslims, they're what they think of racism is you just basically hate a person. You hate a person because it's kind of like the American History X definition of racism. Yeah, so I'm not, for those who just watch this channel for the first time, I am not, a white nationalist. I do believe that every culture deserves to preserve their identity, but and that can be done via Islam. I just, think that we have to think of solutions that are outside the box, that are just not tied to everyone living in their own state, which is basically a foul. It's a pipe dream. Um, but at the same time, we need to come up with practical, feasible solutions. Um, and yeah, that's basically my time for the day. Let me know what you think in the chat. I'm your host Robert from Islam for Europeans. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.